The crack of the whip echoed across the dusty courtyard, a sound so brutally familiar it barely disturbed the vultures circling in the bleached blue sky. The leather bit deep into the man's back, ripping through the thin, sweat-soaked fabric of his shirt and tearing the skin beneath. A collective gasp rose from the other enslaved people forced to watch, a sound quickly smothered by the heavy blanket of fear that perpetually covered the Oliveira plantation. Senor Oliveira himself stood over the man, his face contorted in a mask of practiced fury, the heavy silver handle of the whip gleaming in the relentless Brazilian sun. Useless! Oliveira spat, the word hitting the man, Kyle, with more force than the blow itself. You slow the harvest, you breathe my air, you are nothing but a burden, a piece of broken property. Kyle tasted copper and dirt. He didn't fall. He refused to give the master that satisfaction. He simply stood, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on a point just beyond Oliveira's impeccably polished boots, on the shimmering heat rising from the sugarcane fields that stretched to the horizon, fields that were both their sustenance and their prison. The silence that followed the whipping was heavier than the humid air. Oliveira hated Kyle's silence more than anything. He desired an outcry, a plea for mercy, the satisfying sound of a spirit fracturing, but Kyle offered nothing. He absorbed the pain, locking it away in a place deep inside him that the chains and the whip could not reach. This infuriated the master. Oliveira was a man accustomed to absolute obedience, a man whose vast wealth and status in this colonial outpost were built upon the foundation of broken wills and shattered lives. He circled Kyle like a predator, analyzing its prey, searching for a weakness, a flicker of fear in those dark, unnervingly calm eyes. "Look at me when I discipline you, animal!" Oliveira roared, striking Kyle hard across the face with the back of his hand. The blow sent Kyle staggering, the world tilting momentarily, but still he made no sound. He raised his head slowly, deliberately, and met Oliveira's gaze. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, the master faltered. There was something in Kyle's eyes that disturbed him profoundly. It wasn't defiance, not exactly. It was an unnerving depth, an ancient stillness that seemed to mock Oliveira's petty display of power. It was the look of a man who possessed something the master could never own, and certainly could never understand. This unspoken resistance was a threat to the very order Oliveira had constructed. Around the courtyard, the others watched with a complicated mixture of pity, fear, and confusion. They saw Kyle as a strong man, yes, but perhaps a foolish one. Why invite more pain? Why not bow, scrape, and beg like the rest of them? Survival depended on invisibility, on making oneself small enough to avoid the master's notice. They mistook his silence for weakness, his stillness for resignation. They saw a man enduring the storm, but they did not see the hurricane gathering strength within him. Old Tiana, her hands gnarled from decades of labor in the big house kitchen, whispered a silent prayer, fearing Kale would not survive the day. Young Zola, whose spirit was still fiery and unbroken, felt a surge of impotent rage, wishing Kale would fight back, even if it meant his death. But Kyle remained an enigma, isolated even among his own people. He worked harder than anyone, ate less, and spoke rarely. He seemed to exist in a different reality, observing everything, internalizing the rhythms of the plantation, the monotonous chop of the machetes in the fields, the creak of the ox carts, the distant, sorrowful songs that floated on the evening breeze. He was always watching, always listening, always moving with a strange, coiled energy that unsettled those who paid close enough attention. Oliveira, desperate to regain his psychological advantage, signaled to his chief overseer, a brute of a man named Batista. "String him up," Oliveira commanded, his voice dripping with contempt as he turned away, already bored with the spectacle. "Leave him in the sun, until he learns to speak, until he learns his place." Batista grabbed Kyle, dragging him toward the Pelourinho, the whipping post that stood in the center of the courtyard, as a constant, gruesome reminder of their fate. Kyle didn't struggle. He walked with a strange, almost graceful gait, his movements fluid even in chains, his weight balanced perfectly. As they secured his wrists above his head, the rusted metal biting into his skin, Kyle closed his eyes. The sun beat down on him, the pain in his back a searing fire. But in the darkness behind his eyelids, Kyle wasn't in the courtyard. He was remembering. He was visualizing movements, patterns, a dance he had learned in secret, a legacy passed down from his ancestors, a fight disguised as a game. The plantation existed in a state of constant simmering tension. Oliveira ruled through fear, but fear is a volatile currency. He believed he had broken Kyle, that the public display of brutality had reinforced his authority. He retired to the veranda of the Casa Grande, sipping imported wine and surveying his domain, utterly convinced of his own omnipotence. He saw Kyle hanging from the post, a silhouette against the blinding sun. He saw order, but he was blind to the truth. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the land, Kyle hung there, seemingly defeated. But the rhythm of his breathing remained steady, an internal drumbeat counting down the moments. They all thought they knew this man, defined by his scars and his silence, but what they didn't know was that this silence was not an emptiness, but a container for a storm, and that storm was about to break in a way none of them could ever have imagined. The sun reached its zenith, a merciless white eye staring down at the courtyard. Time distorted, stretching the minutes into agonizing hours. Kyle's muscles screamed in protest, every fiber strained, the circulation in his wrists long gone. The pain in his back had transformed from a sharp fire into a deep tectonic agony. Sweat poured from him, mixing with the blood and dust, baking onto his skin in the suffocating heat. He was drifting, the edges of his vision blurring, the sounds of the plantation, the distant shouts of the overseers, the relentless grinding of the sugar mill, fading into a dull roar. It was a dangerous place to be, this precipice of unconsciousness. To faint was to admit defeat, to give Oliveira the satisfaction he craved. Kyle fought to stay awake, anchoring himself to the physical reality of the rough wood against his cheek. But despair, cold and insidious, began to seep into the cracks of his resolve. The silence, usually his shield, felt heavy, suffocating. He was losing the battle not against the whip, but against the crushing weight of hopelessness. It was in this suspended state, hovering between agony and oblivion, that he heard it. Faint at first, like the beating of a hummingbird's wings, then growing stronger, more insistent. A rhythm, tum-dum-dum, tum-dum-dum. It wasn't coming from the fields or the big house. It seemed to emanate from the earth itself, vibrating through the wooden post and resonating in his bones. It was the sound of the atabaque, the sacred drum, likely coming from the dense jungle where the free people lived in hiding. The sound unlocked a door in his mind, a door he kept bolted shut during the daylight hours. It was the language of his ancestors, the voice of Africa echoing across the vast, cruel ocean. The sound didn't erase the pain, but it intertwined with it, giving it meaning, transforming it from mere suffering into a cadence of resistance. He was no longer at the Pelourinho. He was in the dense forest bordering the plantation, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. The moon cast long, silvery shafts of light through the canopy, illuminating a small clearing. In the center stood Mestre Aquil, an old man whose skin was like ancient parchment etched with the history of a continent Oliveira couldn't even comprehend. Aquil was playing the berimbau, a single-stringed instrument that looked deceptively simple, but held the soul of their resistance. The twang of the wire was hypnotic, a call to arms disguised as a lullaby. "They can chain your body, Kyle." Mestre Aquil's voice resonated low and gravely as Kyle watched the others move in the circle. But they cannot chain the rhythm. The rhythm is Africa. The rhythm is freedom. They brought us here to break us, to make us forget who we are. Capoeira is our memory. It is our freedom dancing. Kyle remembered the grueling training. Mestre Akil was a demanding teacher, forcing Kyle to unlearn the stiff, laborious movements ingrained by years of cutting sugarcane. He had to learn the ginga, the fundamental rocking step. It looked effortless, but it required immense strength and balance. It was the art of constant motion, making oneself an impossible target. Never be still, Kyle. Stillness is death in the field, and it is death in the fight. Ginga. Flow like the river always finds a way around the rock. Kyle trained until his muscles failed, until his lungs burned. Then came the esquiva, the art of evasion. Akil would swing a heavy branch at him, and Kyle learned to drop, twist and pivot, letting the blow pass harmlessly through the space he occupied just moments before. To fight like them, Akil had explained, gesturing towards the big house, is to become like them. We fight with mandinga, with cunning. We dance when they expect us to bleed. He learned that his hands, calloused and strong from the machete, could be used for balance, allowing his legs to become the primary weapons, like the Maya Lua de Compasso, the spinning kick that drew power from the ground itself. The pain of training was different from the pain inflicted by Oliveira. The training was pain with purpose. It was fire-tempering steel. Back at the Pelourinho, Kyle focused on the memory of the ginga. Even bound, he subtly shifted his weight, visualizing the movements, feeling the energy flow through him. He thought of his vow to Mestre Akil, who had disappeared months ago. Some said to a quilombo, others whispered that Batista had killed him. The vow was clear: never use the dance out of hatred, for hatred consumes the hater. Use it only for justice. But the line between justice and vengeance was becoming dangerously blurred in the crucible of the plantation. The constant degradation, the sight of his people suffering, the arrogance of men like Oliveira, it fueled a cold, calculated rage that terrified him. He struggled to keep that rage contained, fearing that if he unleashed it, he would become the very monster he despised. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere on the plantation grew heavier. Oliveira watched Kyle from the veranda, increasingly agitated. The man should have been broken by now. He should have been begging, weeping. Yet there was a defiance in his posture that undermined Oliveira's authority. Every hour, Kyle remained silent was a public testament to the master's inability to fully conquer him. This was unacceptable. Oliveira realized that the whip was insufficient. This slave required a different kind of breaking. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the courtyard in blood-red light, Oliveira gave the order. "Cut him down!" Batista approached and wordlessly cut the ropes. Kyle crumpled to the ground, his limbs numb, the sudden rush of blood to his arms sending waves of nausea through him. He lay there for a long moment, the dust sticking to his wounds. Ultiana shuffled forward, carrying a gourd filled with water. She began to clean his wounds gently. "Why do you do this to yourself, child?" she whispered, her eyes filled with ancient sorrow. "Why not just bow your head? The wind that bends the reed is the wind that breaks the oak." Kale took a sip of the water. "Because, Mama Tiana," he finally replied, his voice hoarse. "Some things are worth breaking for." Oliveira descended from the veranda, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. He looked down at Kyle with cold appraisal. "Your stubbornness is tiresome," he announced, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tonight, you will work the night shift at the mill, the most dangerous job on the plantation. Let's see if your pride can keep you from being crushed by the gears." The others gasped. The mill was a death trap, a cavernous structure filled with massive churning machinery designed to pulverize sugarcane. Working there at night, after a day of torture, was a death sentence. Kyle slowly, agonizingly pushed himself up, staggering but standing on his own 2 feet. He looked Oliveira directly in the eye, the same unnerving stillness radiating from him. He simply nodded, turning toward the looming silhouette of the mill. As he walked away, his gait was uneven, broken, yet beneath the surface the rhythm persisted. He knew Oliveira was trying to kill him, but the master had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was sending Kale into the darkness to die, but he didn't realize that the darkness was where Kale had been forged, and the shadows were about to reveal the true extent of his hidden power. The mill loomed before Kale, like the open maw of some prehistoric beast, its massive wooden gears groaning with a sound that mimicked the grinding of bones. The structure was primitive yet terrifyingly efficient, a monument to human ingenuity turned toward the purpose of extraction and profit. The air inside was thick with the sweet, cloying smell of crushed sugarcane mixed with the acrid stench of sweat and blood. Lanterns hung from rusted chains, casting dancing shadows that made the machinery appear alive, hungry, constantly in motion. Kale entered the mill with the measured pace of a man walking toward his execution, yet his spine remained straight, his breathing controlled. The night shift workers, gaunt, exhausted men whose eyes had long ago lost any spark of hope, glanced at him with a mixture of pity and relief. Relief that it was him, not them, being offered as a sacrifice to Oliveira's cruelty. Batista stood near the main gear shaft, a coiled whip hanging from his belt like a serpent waiting to strike. He was a hulking figure, his face scarred from years of violence both inflicted and endured. He had risen from the ranks of the enslaved to become Oliveira's enforcer, a position that required him to abandon any shred of solidarity with his own people. He was the master's favorite weapon precisely because he understood the psychology of suffering intimately. When Kale approached, Batista didn't even look at him. He simply pointed to the most dangerous station in the entire operation, the feed chute, where raw sugarcane stalks were thrust into the massive rollers that crushed them into pulp. One moment of distraction, one slip of exhausted hands, and a man could be pulled into the machinery, crushed beyond recognition before anyone could react. It had happened before, many times. The stains on the wooden floor told stories that no one spoke aloud. "You work here until dawn," Batista announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "If you slow down, if you stop, I will make what happened in the courtyard feel like a blessing." Kyle nodded, moving to his station. The other workers kept their distance, as if his misfortune might be contagious. He understood. Survival here meant becoming invisible, and anyone who drew the master's wrath became radioactive, untouchable. He was alone, surrounded by people, yet profoundly isolated. The work began immediately. The cane stalks were heavy, fibrous and sharp. His back screamed in protest with every movement, the fresh wounds reopening, blood seeping through the thin fabric of his shirt. The rollers turned with mechanical indifference, demanding a constant rhythm. Feed, push, retreat. Feed, push, retreat. Any deviation from this tempo meant disaster. The heat was suffocating, the humidity making every breath feel like drowning. Sweat poured into his eyes, stinging, blurring his vision. His hands, already raw from the day's labor and the hours spent bound at the Pelourinho, began to blister and bleed within minutes. But Kyle did something the others didn't expect. He synchronized his movements with the machine's rhythm. Feed, push, retreat. It wasn't just labor anymore. It was the ginga, the fundamental step of capoeira, the constant rocking motion that kept a fighter perpetually mobile, perpetually ready. He let the pain flow through him, transforming it into fuel. His body, despite the agony, moved with an unexpected fluidity. The machine demanded rhythm, and rhythm was his language. He wasn't fighting the mill, he was dancing with it, imposing his will upon the mechanical brutality. Batista noticed. He always noticed. He approached slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. "Think you're clever, don't you?" he growled, standing uncomfortably close. "Think you can make this a game?" Kyle didn't respond. He simply continued the rhythm. Feed, push, retreat. His silence infuriated Batista, just as it had infuriated Oliveira. Without warning, Batista grabbed a heavy stalk of sugarcane and swung it like a club toward Kyle's head. It was a test, a casual act of violence meant to break concentration, to force an error that would send Kyle into the rollers. But Kyle's body reacted before his mind could register the threat. He executed a perfect esquiva lateral, dropping his weight and tilting his body to the side, letting the heavy stalk whistle harmlessly past his ear. The movement was so smooth, so economical, that it looked almost accidental, like a man simply stumbling from exhaustion. But it wasn't. It was precision. It was years of training crystallized into a single, life-saving reflex. Batista's eyes narrowed. He had seen something, felt something in that evasion that disturbed him. It was too controlled, too deliberate. He swung again, harder this time, aiming for Kyle's ribs. Again Kyle evaded, this time with an esquiva frontal, dipping forward and letting the blow pass over his back. He never stopped feeding the cane into the rollers. His hands continued their work, even as his body flowed like water around the violence. The other workers had stopped, watching the exchange with a mixture of terror and disbelief. They had never seen anyone move like that, certainly not after a day of torture. Batista was breathing heavily now, frustrated. He was a man who understood only dominance and submission. This fluidity, this refusal to be broken, was outside his comprehension. He raised the stalk for a third strike, putting all his considerable strength behind it, aiming to shatter Kyle's skull. But before he could swing, a voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Batista, enough!" It was Oliveira. He had descended from the Casa Grande, unable to sleep, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't name. He stood at the entrance to the mill, backlit by the moonlight, his silhouette resembling that of a vulture perched on a branch. He had witnessed the exchange, and while he didn't fully understand what he had seen, he sensed that beating Kyle to death in the mill would be anticlimactic, unsatisfying. This slave was proving to be a unique challenge, and Oliveira, despite his cruelty, was a man who appreciated a good hunt. "Let him work," Oliveira commanded, his voice laced with a chilling curiosity. "I want to see how long he can endure. I want to see him break naturally without your help." Batista hesitated, then stepped back, his jaw clenched in frustration. Oliveira approached Kyle, studying him like a naturalist observing an exotic insect. "You are an anomaly," Oliveira mused, circling him slowly. "Most break immediately. Some take days, a few take weeks, but you refuse to break at all. It's fascinating and deeply irritating." He leaned in close, his breath reeking of wine and tobacco. "I will break you, Kyle. Not because I need to, but because I want to. Because your defiance is an insult to the natural order. You are property. You exist to serve. That is the only truth, and I will make you acknowledge it, even if I have to destroy you completely to do so." Kyle finally turned his head, meeting Oliveira's gaze directly. For a long, suspended moment, they stared at each other, two men from utterly different worlds locked in a silent, primal contest of wills. And then Kyle spoke, his voice hoarse but clear, each word chosen with deliberate precision. "You own my body, senor. You can chain it, whip it, work it until it fails, but you do not own this." He tapped his chest directly over his heart, leaving a bloody fingerprint on his shirt. "And you never will." The statement hung in the air, a declaration of war disguised as simple truth. Oliveira's face went pale, then flushed crimson with rage. No slave had ever spoken to him like that, ever. The audacity was staggering, the disrespect complete. He raised his hand to strike Kyle across the face, but then stopped, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Bold words," Oliveira whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "Let us test them." He turned to Batista and the assembled workers. "Tomorrow," he announced loudly, ensuring everyone could hear, "we will have a demonstration. I have recently acquired a new overseer, a man who comes highly recommended for his ability to discipline the unruly. Senor Rocha, He has methods that make Batista here look positively gentle. A collective shudder ran through the workers. They had heard whispers of Rocha, a sadist whose reputation preceded him, a man who took pleasure in the act of breaking human beings. Kyle will be the first to experience Senor Rocha's particular expertise, Oliveira continued, his smile widening. In the courtyard, at noon. I expect all of you to be present. Consider it educational. He turned and walked out of the mill, leaving Kale standing at the rollers, the machinery groaning around him, the weight of the coming ordeal pressing down like a physical force. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating. Kyle worked through the darkness, his body moving on autopilot, fueled by something beyond mere physical endurance. He thought of Mestre Akil, of the countless nights spent training in secret, of the berimbao's haunting melody. He thought of the vow he had made, to use the dance only for justice, never for hatred. But as the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, illuminating the blood and sweat staining the mill floor, Kyle felt the line between justice and vengeance dissolving. Oliveira had pushed him to the edge, and tomorrow in that courtyard, surrounded by the entire plantation, he would either be broken completely or he would reveal the storm that had been gathering within him all along. The other workers avoided his eyes as the shift finally ended, filing out of the mill in exhausted silence. They had witnessed something they couldn't name, a shift in the invisible currents that governed their brutal existence. Kyle was no longer just a slave enduring punishment. He had become something else entirely, something dangerous, something inevitable. As Kyle stumbled out into the pale morning light, his vision swimming, his body screaming for rest, he heard it again, faint, distant. The rhythm of the atabaque carried on the wind from the depths of the jungle. Tum-dum-dum, tum-dum-dum, it was a call, a reminder, a promise. And deep within the darkness of his exhausted soul, Kyle felt the first stirrings of the storm preparing to break, and he knew that tomorrow everything would change. The morning arrived not with hope, but with the oppressive certainty of violence. News of the noon demonstration had spread through the plantation like wildfire, carried on whispered conversations and fearful glances. No one worked with their usual rhythm. The machetes moved more slowly through the sugarcane. The ox carts rolled with less urgency. Even the overseers seemed distracted, anticipating the spectacle that Oliveira had promised. The courtyard was being prepared like an arena, the Pelourinho standing at its center like a grotesque altar. Senor Rocha had arrived at dawn, riding a black horse that seemed to share its master's temperament, skittish, mean-spirited and unpredictable. He was a lean man, almost skeletal, with hollow cheeks and eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. Unlike Batista, whose brutality was straightforward and physical, Rocha's cruelty was calculated, psychological. He believed in breaking the spirit first, reducing a person to nothing before touching their body. He dismounted with practiced elegance and surveyed the plantation with the detached assessment of a butcher examining livestock. Oliveira greeted him on the veranda, offering imported brandy despite the early hour. "The one I told you about is in the quarters," Oliveira explained, gesturing vaguely toward the rows of dilapidated shacks where the enslaved people lived. "He has proven resistant to conventional methods. I need him broken publicly, completely. I need the others to see that defiance leads only to absolute destruction." Rocha sipped his brandy, nodding slowly. "Resistance is merely a lack of imagination, Senor Oliveira. The body can endure remarkable pain, but the mind is fragile. It requires only the right pressure point. By noon, your slave will not remember his own name, much less his pride." The two men laughed, a sound that carried across the courtyard like the cawing of carrion birds. In the slave quarters, Kale sat on the dirt floor of the communal hut, his back against the rough wooden wall. He hadn't slept. Sleep would have been a luxury, a surrender to the exhaustion that threatened to consume him. Instead, he had spent the night in meditation, a practice Mestre Akil had taught him. The body can be in chains, but the mind must remain free. Find the quiet place inside yourself, the place where pain cannot reach. That is your fortress. Old Tiana entered the hut, carrying a wooden bowl containing a thin gruel. She set it down beside Kyle, her hands trembling. "You must eat something, child," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You will need your strength." Kyle looked at the gruel, but made no move to touch it. His stomach was a knot of tension, incapable of accepting food. "Mama Tiana," he said softly, "if I do not survive today, I need you to remember something. Tell the others. Tell them that silence is not weakness. Tell them that we are not what they say we are. We are not property. We are not animals. We are people, and people cannot be owned, no matter how many chains they forge." Tiana's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and touched his face gently, as a mother would touch a beloved child. "I know, Kyle. I have always known. But knowing changes nothing in this place. This place devours knowledge, devours hope, devours everything good." Kyle took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Then maybe it's time someone reminded this place that it can also be devoured." The words hung in the air, strange and prophetic. Tiana didn't understand them, not fully, but she felt their weight, their implication. She kissed his forehead and left quickly, afraid that if she stayed longer, she would dissolve into the grief she had kept buried for decades. Young Zola appeared in the doorway moments later, her eyes blazing with a fury that mirrored Kale's own internal fire. "They're saying Rocha will use the iron," she hissed, her voice shaking. "They're saying he brought special tools from the city. Kale, you have to run, now, while you still can. We'll create a distraction, anything, just go." Kyle shook his head slowly. "If I run, they will punish all of you. You know this. Oliveira's justice is collective. He will make an example of everyone who might have helped me. I cannot carry that burden." Zola's fists clenched in frustration. "Then what? You just let them destroy you? For what? For pride?" Kyle stood slowly, every muscle protesting, and walked to the small, cracked window that looked out toward the jungle. The sun was climbing steadily, marking the passage of time toward noon with indifferent precision. "Not pride, Zola. For memory. Our people have survived horrors beyond imagination. We have been scattered across the ocean, torn from our homes, stripped of our names, our languages, our gods. But we survived because we remembered who we were. We carried Africa in our hearts, in our rhythms, in our movements. Capoeira is that memory made flesh. It is our ancestors speaking through us, dancing through us. And today, those ancestors will speak very loudly." Zola stared at him, confusion and awe warring on her young face. "I don't understand," she admitted. "You will," Kale replied, turning to face her fully. For the first time since his ordeal began, he smiled. It was a strange smile, not of joy, but of acceptance, of readiness. "Before the sun sets today, Zola, everyone on this plantation will understand." The bell rang at 1:15, summoning everyone to the courtyard. It was the same bell used to mark the beginning and end of work shifts, but today its tone sounded different, heavier, more ominous, like the tolling of a funeral. The enslaved people filed into the courtyard slowly, reluctantly, forming a loose circle around the Pelourinho. The overseers stood at strategic points, whips coiled and ready, ensuring no one attempted to leave or look away. This was mandatory viewing. Oliveira wanted witnesses. He wanted the lesson etched into every mind. Senor Rocha stood near a small table upon which he had arranged his instruments with the precision of a surgeon. Metal rods, leather straps with embedded thorns, and a brazier heating a series of iron implements until they glowed red. He worked in silence, methodical and unhurried, letting the anticipation build, letting fear do half his work for him. Batista dragged Kyle into the courtyard. Kyle's wrists were bound behind his back, but he walked without resistance, his head held high. his gaze fixed on something beyond the physical reality of the plantation. The crowd parted silently as he passed, no one daring to meet his eyes. They had convinced themselves that witnessing this would somehow make them safer, that by watching Kyle's destruction they would avoid a similar fate. They were wrong, of course. Oliveira's cruelty was arbitrary and absolute, but hope, even false hope, was a powerful narcotic in a place where genuine hope had long since died. Oliveira himself stood on a raised platform that had been hastily constructed for the occasion, giving him an unobstructed view of the proceedings. He looked down at Kyle with the satisfied expression of a man about to enjoy a fine meal. "Senor Rocha," Oliveira announced, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard, "you may begin whenever you are ready. I want this one to serve as a permanent reminder of the consequences of defiance." Rocha approached Kyle slowly, circling him like a predator, studying him from every angle. "What is your name, slave?" Rocha asked, his voice surprisingly soft, almost gentle. Kyle remained silent. "I asked you a question," Rocha repeated, his tone unchanged. "In my experience, silence is the first wall a stubborn man builds, but walls can be dismantled brick by brick." He nodded to Batista, who forced Kyle to his knees. The rough ground bit into Kyle's kneecaps, sending fresh waves of pain through his already tortured body. Rocha selected one of the heated irons from the brazier, examining it with professional detachment. The metal glowed orange, radiating heat that could be felt from several feet away. "This," Rocha explained, as if lecturing students, "is not merely an instrument of pain. It is an instrument of transformation. It rewrites the story a man tells himself about who he is. After this, you will not remember defiance, you will remember only obedience." He moved toward Kale, the iron raised, and the crowd collectively held its breath. This was the moment. This was when Kale would scream, when he would beg, when he would finally break. Rocha pressed the iron toward Kale's shoulder, close enough that the heat singed the fabric of his shirt. But then something extraordinary happened. Kyle began to hum. It was barely audible at first, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate from deep within his chest. It wasn't a song of pain or despair. It was something else entirely. It was the rhythm of the berimbau, the sacred sound of Capoeira, the voice of his ancestors carried across centuries of suffering and resistance. The humming grew louder, more insistent, filling the courtyard with a sound that seemed utterly out of place in this theater of cruelty. Rocha hesitated, genuinely confused. Oliveira leaned forward on his platform, his brow furrowed. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how broken men behaved. And then Kyle began to move. Despite the bindings, despite the pain, despite everything, his body began to rock subtly, finding the rhythm, embodying it. The ginga, even on his knees, even restrained, he was dancing. The movement was minimal but unmistakable to anyone who understood. His weight shifted from knee to knee in a fluid, controlled motion that defied his circumstances. Rocha stepped back, genuinely unnerved. What are you doing?" he demanded, his composure cracking. Kyle stopped humming. He raised his head, and when he spoke, his voice was clear, strong, and utterly devoid of fear. "I am remembering, Senor Rocha. I am remembering who I am. I am remembering where I come from. And I'm reminding you that you can burn my skin, break my bones, even kill me. But you cannot erase the rhythm. The rhythm is eternal. The rhythm is freedom, and freedom once tasted can never be forgotten." The words landed like physical blows. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. No one had ever spoken to an overseer like that, much less to someone of Rocha's reputation. It was suicide. It was madness, but it was also something else. It was a crack in the foundation of the entire system, a glimpse of a reality where the power structure could be challenged, where the seemingly powerless could claim agency. Old Tiana felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't explain why. Young Zola's heart pounded with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Even some of the overseers shifted uncomfortably, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, something that transcended the simple punishment of a defiant slave. Oliveira's face had gone from smug satisfaction to pale fury. He stood abruptly, pointing at Rocha with a trembling finger. "I said break him! Do it now!" Rocha, desperate to reassert his authority and salvage his reputation, pressed the hot iron directly against Cale's shoulder. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, acrid and nauseating. But Cale did not scream. His body tensed, every muscle contracting against the agony, but the sound that emerged from his throat was not a scream. It was a shout, a battle cry, the sound of defiance crystallized into pure, unadulterated will. "Axe!" The word echoed across the courtyard, a word from the Yoruba language meaning vital force, spiritual power, the life energy that connects all things. It was a word that had survived the Middle Passage, that had been whispered in the holds of slave ships, that had been passed down from generation to generation as a reminder of their true identity. And in that moment, something shifted. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, more charged. The crowd, which had been frozen in horrified fascination, began to stir. Whispers spread like wildfire. Eyes that had been downcast began to lift. Spines that had been bent began to straighten, just slightly, but noticeably. Oliveira saw it happening, and terror gripped him. He understood instinctively that he was losing control, not of Kyle, but of the entire plantation. The invisible chains of fear and resignation that kept the system functioning were beginning to fray, and if they broke completely, he would be swept away. "Enough!" Oliveira shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Batista, take him back to the quarters. Lock him up. We will deal with him later." But it was too late. The moment had already passed from Oliveira's control into something larger, something collective. Kyle had planted a seed, and seeds, once planted in fertile soil, have a will of their own. As Batista roughly hauled Kyle to his feet and dragged him toward the quarters, Kyle turned his head one final time, making eye contact with as many people as he could. And in his eyes they saw not defeat, but promise. The storm that had been gathering was about to break, and when it did, nothing on the Oliveira plantation would ever be the same again. Night fell over the plantation like a shroud, but it brought no peace. The air was thick with tension, an electric charge that made skin prickle and hearts race. In the quarters, the enslaved people gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Something had changed in the courtyard. They had all felt it, seen it in Cale's eyes, heard it in that ancient word he had shouted, "Axe." For years, they had survived by making themselves small, invisible, accepting their fate with the numb resignation of the defeated. But Cale's refusal to break had awakened something dormant within them, something dangerous and beautiful. It was the memory of their own humanity, and once remembered, it could not be forgotten again. Old Tiana moved through the quarters, distributing what little food remained, but her mind was elsewhere. She had lived through rebellions before, had seen them crushed with horrifying brutality. She knew what happened to those who dared to rise against their masters. The reprisals were swift and merciless. Public executions, families torn apart, entire communities decimated as warnings to others. And yet, as she looked into the eyes of the younger ones, she saw something she hadn't seen in decades. Hope, reckless, dangerous, intoxicating hope. In the locked storage shed where Batista had thrown him, Kyle sat in darkness, his back against the rough wooden wall. The burn on his shoulder throbbed with a deep, nauseating pain, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning in his chest. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the forest clearing, to Mestre Aquil's final lesson. It had been 3 months before the old master disappeared, and the night air had been cool, filled with the sounds of nocturnal creatures and the distant thunder of an approaching storm. Kyle, Akil had said, his weathered hands resting on the berimbau. There will come a moment when you must choose. The line between justice and vengeance is thin, almost invisible in the heat of rage. Vengeance seeks to inflict pain for pain's sake. It consumes the avenger as thoroughly as it destroys the enemy. But justice seeks balance. It seeks to restore what was broken, to heal what was wounded. The dance I have taught you is powerful. It can kill, but it is meant to liberate, not to destroy. Kyle had asked the question that haunted him even now. What if liberation requires destruction, Mestre? What if the only way to be free is to remove those who enslave us? Akil had been quiet for a long moment, the berimbau's single string humming softly in the breeze. Then you must ask yourself, after they are gone, who will you be? Will you be free, or will you simply be a different kind of prisoner, trapped in the cycle of violence? Kyle opened his eyes in the darkness of the shed. Tomorrow, or perhaps even tonight, he would have to answer that question definitively. He could feel it approaching like the storm that night in the forest, inevitable and transformative. Meanwhile, in the Casa Grande, Oliveira paced his study like a caged animal, a crystal glass of whiskey clutched in his trembling hand. Rocha sat in a leather chair, his usual composure shattered. The afternoon's events had shaken him more than he cared to admit. That slave is dangerous, Rocha said quietly, staring into the fireplace. Not because of his body, but because of what he represents. He is a symbol. Symbols can ignite movements. I've seen it before in other plantations. One defiant slave inspires others, and before you know it, you have a full-scale rebellion. Oliveira drained his glass and slammed it down on the mahogany desk. Then we eliminate the symbol. Tonight, quietly, an accident. He was weak from the punishment his heart gave out. Simple, final. Rocha shook his head slowly. You don't understand. It's already too late for that. You saw their faces in the courtyard. They're watching now. If he dies suspiciously, he becomes a martyr. Martyrs are even more dangerous than living symbols. They inspire guilt, rage, and a sense of obligation to continue their fight. Oliveira's face twisted with frustration and fear. Then what do you suggest? I'm not going to cower in my own house because some slave learned to dance. Rocha stood, moving to the window that overlooked the quarters. Small fires burned outside the shacks, and he could see figures moving in the darkness. More activity than usual for this late hour. We need to demonstrate absolute power. Not through torture, that failed. We need to break them psychologically. Tomorrow we separate Kyle from the others. We sell him, far away. And we bring in fresh slaves to replace the troublemakers. We dilute the resistance before it can coalesce. But even as Rocha spoke, both men knew they were scrambling, reacting rather than controlling. The initiative had shifted, and that shift was more terrifying than any physical threat. In the quarters, young Zola found herself at the center of an impromptu gathering. 20 people, maybe more, crowded into the largest hut, their faces illuminated by a single flickering candle. We can't just let them kill him. A man named Tomas whispered urgently. He was strong, his arms corded with muscle from years in the cane fields, but his eyes betrayed his fear. If we do, everything he said, everything he showed us, it means nothing. An older woman named Esperanza shook her head. And if we act, they will slaughter us all. You've heard the stories from other plantations. Rebellions always end the same way. Bodies hanging from trees, children sold away. The survivors worked until they drop. Is one man's life worth all of ours? The question hung heavy in the stifling air. Zola felt the weight of it, the impossible calculus of survival. But then she remembered Kyle's words to her that morning. We are not property. We are not animals. We are people. He's not just one man, Zola said quietly, and the room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. He's all of us. Every time we swallow our rage, every time we bow our heads, every time we accept their version of who we are, we die a little. Kyle refused to die, and whether we help him or not, whether he lives or dies, he showed us that refusal is possible. That's worth something, that's worth everything. The room erupted in whispered arguments, some agreeing, others insisting on caution. But the seed was growing, pushing through the hard soil of fear, reaching toward a light they had almost forgotten existed. At that moment, the shed door burst open. Kyle looked up, expecting Batista or perhaps Rocha coming to finish the job quietly. But instead, he saw a small figure silhouetted against the moonlight. It was Zola, her finger pressed to her lips, signaling silence. Behind her, moving like shadows, were 6 others: Tomas, young Miguel, twin sisters named Rosa and Rita, and 2 men Kyle recognized from the mill. "We're getting you out," Zola whispered, kneeling to work on the ropes binding his wrists. "There's a path through the cane fields. We've used it before to reach the stream. If you follow it north, you'll find the jungle, and beyond that, the Quilombo." Kyle shook his head even as she worked to free him. "If I run, Oliveira will punish all of you. You know this." Tomas stepped forward. "Then we all run, together, or we make a stand, here, tonight. Either way, we're done bowing." Kyle's wrists came free. He rubbed the circulation back into his hands, feeling the old calluses, the new wounds, the strength that remained despite everything. He looked at their faces, scared, determined, desperate. They were looking to him for leadership, for guidance. But Kyle knew his path was not necessarily theirs. "Listen to me carefully," Kyle said, his voice low but intense. "If you run tonight, some of you will make it to freedom. Others won't. The Quilombo is real, but the journey is dangerous. If you stay and fight, many of you will die. Maybe all of you. This is not a choice I can make for you. Each person must decide what they can live with and what they can't." Rosa, one of the twins, spoke up. "What about you? What will you do?" Kyle stood slowly, every muscle protesting. He moved to the door and looked out at the plantation, the Casa Grande glowing with lamplight, the mill standing silent and ominous, the field stretching endlessly toward a horizon he could barely see. "I'm going to do what Mestre Aquil taught me. I'm going to dance, one last time, and if Oliveira wants to stop me, he'll have to face me himself, not hide behind his overseers and his whips." The others exchanged glances, not fully understanding. Zola gripped his arm. "Kyle, that's suicide. There are dozens of them armed. You're one man, injured, exhausted." Kyle turned to face her, and in the moonlight, his expression was serene, almost peaceful. "I'm not just one man, Zola. I carry Mestre Aquil. I carry every ancestor who survived the ships, the auctions, the fields. I carry Africa. And Africa cannot be killed with whips and chains. It can only be honored. Tonight I honor it." Without waiting for a response, Kyle walked out of the shed into the open courtyard. The moon was full, casting everything in sharp relief. His footsteps were silent on the packed earth as he moved toward the center, toward the Pelourinho, where he had been bound and tortured. He stopped there, closed his eyes, and began to breathe deeply, centering himself. Then he began to move. The Ginga. Slow at first, his body swaying from side to side, finding the rhythm that existed beneath all things. His bare feet traced patterns in the dust, ancient geometries passed down through generations. He didn't need the berimbau or the atabaque. The rhythm was inside him, in his blood, in his bones. He began to hum, the same sound he had made in front of Rocha, but now it grew louder, more confident, filling the night air. In the Casa Grande, Oliveira heard it. He rushed to the window and saw Kyle moving in the courtyard alone, dancing. "What is he doing?" Oliveira hissed. "Is he insane?" Rocha joined him at the window, watching with a mixture of fascination and horror. He's issuing a challenge. In his culture, this dance is not just movement. It's a conversation, a negotiation, a battle. He's calling you out. Oliveira's face flushed with rage and humiliation. "Then I will answer. Batista, assemble the overseers, bring the dogs. I want that slave dragged to the Pelourinho and beaten until there's nothing left. But as Batista and 6 armed overseers moved into the courtyard, something unexpected happened. The enslaved people began emerging from the quarters. Not to fight, not to flee, simply to watch. They formed a circle around Kale, their presence a silent declaration of solidarity. Old Tiana was there, young Zola, Tomas and Miguel and the twins, dozens more. They didn't move to help him, but they refused to look away. They were bearing witness, and in that act of witnessing, they were transforming from isolated individuals into a community, from property into people. Kale's dance intensified. He executed a Maya Lua de Compasso, a spinning kick that whistled through the air with lethal grace. Then an armada, then a martello. Each movement was perfect, a testament to years of hidden practice. He was no longer the broken slave who had hung from the post. He was a warrior, and his weapon was his own body, honed and disciplined by tradition and suffering. Batista entered the circle first, whip raised. He swung it at Kale's legs, trying to trip him. But Kale flowed around the strike with an esquiva, dropping low, then exploded upward with a benso, a pushing kick that caught Batista square in the chest and sent him flying backward. The overseer landed hard, the wind knocked out of him, his eyes wide with shock. 2 more overseers rushed in simultaneously from different angles. Kyle spun between them, his movements impossibly fast, and delivered a double rabo de araya, a spinning kick that connected with both men's heads. They dropped like stones. The remaining overseers hesitated, fear replacing their bravado. They had never seen anything like this. This wasn't brawling or desperate fighting. This was art. This was mastery. This was something beyond their comprehension. Oliveira watched from the veranda, his face white as chalk. Everything he believed about control, about power, about the natural order was crumbling before his eyes. "Shoot him!" he screamed at the overseer holding a musket. "Shoot him now!" The overseer raised the musket with trembling hands, took aim, and fired. The shot rang out across the plantation, a sharp crack that seemed to freeze time itself. But Kyle had been watching. He had seen the overseer's intention, read it in the man's body language. At the precise moment of firing, Kyle executed a negativa, dropping into a low crouch, his hand touching the ground for balance. The musket ball whistled overhead, missing by inches, and buried itself in the wooden wall of the mill. Before the overseer could reload, Kale moved. He closed the distance with a bananera, a handstand that transitioned into a queixada, a spinning kick that connected with the musket, knocking it from the overseer's hands and sending it skittering across the courtyard. The overseer stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, and fell. Kyle stood in the center of the circle, breathing hard, sweat pouring down his face, his eyes blazing with an inner fire. Around him, the circle of witnesses had grown. Nearly everyone on the plantation was there now, drawn by the sounds of conflict, staying because of what they saw. The impossible made real, the powerless claiming power. Oliveira, consumed by rage and terror, grabbed a sword from its decorative mounting on the wall and descended from the veranda. He pushed through the crowd, which parted reluctantly before him. He entered the circle and pointed the blade at Kale. "You want to die like a warrior?" Oliveira snarled, his voice breaking. "Fine, I will kill you like one. And then I will kill 10 more, and 10 more after that. I will drown this rebellion in blood." Kale looked at the sword, then at Oliveira. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally he spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "You can kill me, Senor Oliveira. You have the weapon. You have the law. You have everything that this world says gives you the right, but you will never have what I have. You will never have freedom, because freedom is not something granted by others. It is something that lives inside you, and no sword can touch it." Oliveira charged, swinging the sword wildly, but his movements were clumsy, born of rage rather than skill. Kyle evaded easily, flowing around each strike like water. He wasn't counterattacking. He was simply dancing, staying just out of reach, letting Oliveira exhaust himself. And with each failed strike, Oliveira looked more foolish, more desperate, more utterly defeated. Finally, Oliveira stumbled, falling to his knees in the dust, the sword slipping from his hands. He knelt there, panting, his perfectly tailored clothes stained with sweat and dirt, his carefully constructed aura of invincibility shattered. Kyle stood over him. He could kill Oliveira now. One kick, one strike, justice, or was it vengeance, was within reach. The entire plantation held its breath. But Kyle thought of Mestre Akil. He thought of the question, after they are gone, who will you be? Slowly, deliberately, Kyle stepped back. He did not strike. He did not take the sword. Instead, he extended his hand to Oliveira, not to help him up, but in a gesture that was somehow more powerful. It was an offering of mercy, of the possibility of a different world. Oliveira stared at the hand as if it were a serpent. He did not take it. He spat in the dust and staggered to his feet unaided, his face a mask of humiliation and hatred. "This isn't over," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. He turned and retreated to the Casa Grande, and no one moved to follow him. The circle remained, surrounding Kyle, and slowly, one by one, they began to hum. The same rhythm Kyle had hummed. The sound grew, becoming a chorus, a song, a declaration that echoed across the plantation and into the jungle beyond, where the free people of the Quilombo heard it and smiled, knowing that another seed of liberation had been planted and that the harvest was coming. Dawn broke over the Oliveira plantation with a strange, unsettling quiet. The sun rose blood-red on the horizon, painting the sugarcane fields in shades of amber and crimson, as if the earth itself were acknowledging the violence and transformation of the previous night. But something fundamental had shifted. The enslaved people moved through their morning routines with a different energy, not openly defiant, but no longer invisibly submissive. Their backs were straighter. Their eyes met each other's with a shared understanding. They had witnessed something impossible, and that impossibility had rewritten the boundaries of what they believed could exist in their world. Kyle sat outside the quarters, his back against the rough wooden wall, watching the sunrise. His body was a landscape of pain. The burn on his shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. His muscles screamed from the night's exertion, and exhaustion pulled at him like an undertow. But his mind was clear, crystalline, focused. He knew this was not an ending. It was barely even a beginning. What happened next would determine whether last night had been a meaningful act of resistance or simply a spectacular, ultimately futile gesture. Ultiana approached him slowly, carrying a bowl of water and clean cloth. Without speaking, she began to tend to his wounds with practiced, gentle hands. Her touch was maternal, careful, and her silence spoke volumes. After several minutes, she finally whispered, "You should have killed him, child. Men like Oliveira don't learn. They don't change. They only wait for the right moment to strike back. And when they do, their vengeance is absolute." Kyle watched the sunrise, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps, Mama Tiana, but if I had killed him, what would I have become? Another man who solves problems with violence? Another master, just with a different face? The dance Mestre Akil taught me was never meant to perpetuate the cycle. It was meant to break it." Tiana paused in her ministrations, her ancient eyes searching his face. "And you think mercy breaks cycles? You think showing compassion to a man who has shown none will somehow transform him?" Kale turned to meet her gaze. "No, I don't think it will transform him. But it might transform us. Every act of violence, justified or not, changes the person who commits it. I refuse to let Oliveira determine who I become. That choice, that refusal, is the only real freedom I have." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She nodded slowly, understanding something she couldn't quite articulate. She finished cleaning his wounds in silence, then kissed his forehead as she had done the previous day. But this time, the gesture carried a different weight. It was no longer a benediction for the dying. It was recognition of something being born. In the Casa Grande, Oliveira sat in his study, the room in disarray. He had spent the night drinking, hurling furniture, screaming orders that no one obeyed. Rocha had left before dawn, muttering about contracts and impossibilities, his reputation as the great breaker of slaves permanently tarnished. The other overseers moved through the house like ghosts, uncertain of their positions, their authority suddenly revealed as fragile and conditional. Batista stood in the doorway, his chest still aching from where Cale's kick had landed. "Senor," he said quietly, "the others are talking. The field workers, the house servants, everyone. They're saying that Slave defeated you, that he made you look weak. If we don't respond, if we don't reassert control, I know." Oliveira roared, hurling his glass against the wall where it shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments. "Do you think I don't know? But what do you suggest, Batista? We tried whipping him, we tried humiliating him, we tried torture, we even tried to shoot him, and he danced around it all like it was nothing, like we were nothing." The words hung in the air, a confession of impotence that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Batista shifted uncomfortably. "There are other methods. We could poison him, arrange an accident, make it look natural." Oliveira stared at his overseer for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "And create a martyr? No, that's exactly what we cannot do. The moment he dies suspiciously, he becomes immortal. His memory becomes more dangerous than he ever was alive. We're trapped, Batista. Trapped by our own system. We built this plantation on fear, and that fear has been broken. Once broken, it cannot be simply glued back together." He moved to the window, looking out at the fields where work had begun. But the rhythm was wrong, the usual frantic pace replaced by something more deliberate, almost leisurely. "There's only one option left," Oliveira said quietly. "I will sell him. Today. I have a contact in Rio who deals in difficult slaves. They send them to the mines in Minas Gerais. No one survives more than a year in those mines. The work is brutal, the conditions inhuman. He will die there, slowly, painfully, and far away, where his death cannot inspire anything here." Batista nodded slowly. It wasn't the immediate, violent retribution he craved, but it was pragmatic. "I'll make the arrangements." As the morning progressed, word spread quickly through the plantation. Cale was to be sold. The cart would arrive by midday to take him away. The reaction was complex, relief from some who feared the reprisals that might follow if he stayed, grief from others who had begun to see him as a symbol of something larger than any individual, and rage from a few, like Zola, who viewed his removal as a betrayal of everything he had demonstrated. Zola found Cale near the well, drinking water slowly, methodically. "You can't let them do this," she hissed urgently. "You defeated them. You showed everyone that they're not invincible. If you just leave, if you let them ship you away, what was the point?" Kyle set down the water gourd and looked at her with an expression of profound calm. "The point, Zola, was never about me staying or leaving. The point was showing you, all of you, that resistance is possible. That you are not what they say you are, that you have power even when they hold all the weapons. Whether I'm here or in Rio or in Minas Gerais or dead, that truth remains. They cannot sell it, they cannot whip it, they cannot kill it, it lives in you now." Zola's eyes blazed with frustration and unshed tears. "Pretty words, but words don't change anything. Action does, and you're just surrendering." Kyle reached out and gently took her hands. They were young hands, strong from labor, but not yet completely calloused into numbness. "I am not surrendering, Zola. I am choosing. There is a difference. Surrender is passive, choice is active. I choose to go because my staying would bring more violence, more death." Oliveira is looking for an excuse to reassert his power through mass punishment. I will not give him that excuse. So we just forget. Go back to how things were. Her voice broke on the question. "No," Kyle said firmly. "Nothing will ever be how it was. The seed has been planted. Now it needs time to grow. Some seeds sprout quickly, others take seasons. But once planted in fertile soil, they are inevitable. Be patient, be smart, and when the moment comes, and it will come, be ready. He released her hands and turned to face the small crowd that had gathered, drawn by their conversation. Tomas was there, Miguel, the twins, old Tiana, and dozens of others, their faces reflecting a complicated mixture of emotions. Kyle addressed them all, his voice carrying clearly, "I want you to remember something. What happened last night was not magic. It was not a miracle. It was the result of discipline, training, and the refusal to accept someone else's definition of who I am. Every single one of you has that same power. You may not know Capoeira. You may not have trained in secret. But you have something even more important. You have each other. Community is stronger than any chain. Solidarity is more powerful than any whip. Remember that. Protect each other, teach each other, and never, ever forget that you are human beings, worthy of dignity, worthy of freedom." The crowd was silent, absorbing his words. Then, slowly, old Tiana began to hum. The same rhythm from the night before. Others joined, one voice at a time, until the courtyard was filled with the sound, not loud, not aggressive, but steady, persistent, undeniable. It was the sound of memory, of resistance, of hope taking root in the hardest soil imaginable. At noon, the cart arrived. It was pulled by 2 tired horses and driven by a rough-looking man who specialized in transporting difficult cargo. He carried iron shackles and a loaded musket, clearly expecting trouble. But when Kyle walked to the cart voluntarily, his head high, his movement still carrying that strange, fluid grace, the driver seemed almost disappointed. Oliveira watched from the veranda, refusing to come down, refusing to acknowledge Kyle directly. But his eyes followed every movement, and in them was not triumph, but a hollowness, the recognition that he had not won, merely survived. As Kyle climbed into the cart, Zola pushed through the crowd. "Wait!" she called out. She ran to him and pressed something into his hand, a small wooden carving, roughly made but clearly crafted with care. It was a berimbau, no bigger than his palm. "Mestre Akil made this," she explained quickly, her words tumbling over each other. "Before he disappeared, he gave it to me. He said to give it to someone who understood what it meant. I think he meant you." Kyle closed his fingers around the tiny instrument, feeling its weight, its significance. "Thank you, Zola. Guard the rhythm. Pass it on. That's all any of us can do." The driver cracked his whip, and the cart lurched forward. As it rolled toward the main gate, Kyle looked back one last time at the Oliveira plantation. He saw the faces of the people he was leaving behind, some crying, some stoic, all changed. He saw the fields where he had labored, the Pelourinho where he had been tortured, the courtyard where he had danced. And he saw, in the distance, the dark line of the jungle where the Quilombos waited, where freedom existed not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. The cart passed through the gate and onto the road that would take him to Rio, to the mines, to whatever fate awaited. But Kyle was not afraid. He had done what he set out to do. He had remembered who he was, and in remembering, he had helped others remember themselves. The journey to Rio took 3 days. The driver was surprisingly quiet, not cruel, simply indifferent. At night, shackled to the cart, Kyle looked up at the stars, the same stars his ancestors had navigated by, the same stars that connected him to a heritage that no amount of bondage could erase. He thought about Mestre Akil's question, "Who will you be after they are gone?" He had his answer now. He would be a man who chose justice over vengeance, who chose dignity over hatred, who chose to plant seeds even when he might never see the harvest. On the 4th day, something unexpected happened. The cart stopped in a small village to resupply. The driver went into a tavern, leaving Kyle alone with the horses, and from the shadows of the village square, 3 figures emerged. They moved with a particular gait, a fluid grace that Kyle recognized instantly. Capoeiristas. "Brother," one of them whispered, a young man with intelligent eyes and scarred knuckles. "We heard about what happened at the Oliveira plantation. Word travels fast in our circles. We're here to offer you a choice." He produced a key, clearly stolen or copied from the driver's belongings. "You can continue to Rio and almost certain death, or you can come with us. There's a Quilombo 3 days north. Mestre Akil is there. He sent us to find you." Kyle's heart stuttered. "Akil is alive?" The young man smiled. "Very much so. And he has been waiting for you. He knew you would eventually understand. He knew you would make the choice between the easy path and the right one. Now the question is, will you come?" Kyle looked at the shackles on his wrists, at the cart that was meant to carry him to death, at the 3 men offering liberation. The choice should have been simple, but he thought about the people at the Oliveira plantation, about Zola and Tomas and old Tiana. If he disappeared, would they think he had abandoned them? Would they lose faith in the message he had tried to convey? "If I go," Kyle said slowly, "Oliveira will punish them. He'll assume they helped me escape." The young capoeirista shook his head. "We've already arranged that. Tonight there will be a fire in the village warehouse. Accidental, no one hurt. In the confusion, the driver will assume you were taken by bandits. Common enough on these roads. By the time anyone investigates, you'll be long gone, and there will be no trail leading back to the plantation." Kyle looked down at the tiny wooden berimbau in his hand, the gift from Zola, the legacy from Akil. He thought about freedom, not as an endpoint, but as a journey, a choice made again and again every day. He thought about the Quilombo, about the possibility of living not as property, but as a person, surrounded by others who understood the rhythm, who carried the memory. "Then unlock these chains," Kyle said quietly. "I'm going home." The shackles fell away with a soft click. Kyle stood, rubbing his wrists where the metal had bitten into the skin. He followed the 3 capoeiristas into the forest, moving quickly, silently, like shadows fleeing the dying light. Behind them in the village, the fire would soon start. The driver would curse and search, and eventually report that his cargo had been stolen by bandits, a common enough occurrence that it would warrant little investigation. And at the Oliveira plantation, life would continue, but it would never be the same. Weeks later, in the Quilombo hidden deep in the Brazilian jungle, Kyle stood in a clearing very similar to the one where he had first learned the dance. The sun filtered through the canopy in shafts of golden light. The sound of the berimbau filled the air, its single string singing the ancient song of resistance and memory. Mestre Akil stood across from him, older, grayer, but his eyes still sharp, still filled with that quiet wisdom. "You made it," Akil said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I knew you would. I knew you understood." They embraced, 2 men connected by more than teaching and learning, by more than the dance, connected by the understanding that freedom is not given, but claimed, and that the claiming is a journey without end. Around them, the Quilombo thrived. Dozens of people who had escaped, who had chosen the dangerous path of liberty over the certain misery of bondage. They farmed, they built, they raised children who would never know the whip. And every evening, as the sun set, they gathered in the clearing to train, to dance, to remember. Kyle became a teacher, passing on what Akil had taught him, adding his own experiences, his own understanding. He taught them the ginga, the esquiva, the meia lua de compasso, but more importantly, he taught them the philosophy behind the movements. Capoeira, he would tell his students, is not about fighting. It's about dignity. It's about refusing to let others define who you are. It's about maintaining your humanity in a world designed to strip it away. The dance is just the language we use to speak that truth, but the truth itself that is universal, that is eternal. Years passed. The Oliveira plantation eventually collapsed, not through violent rebellion, but through economic decay. The system that had seemed so permanent, so absolute, revealed itself to be fragile, dependent on the willing submission of those it oppressed. When that submission cracked, the entire structure crumbled. Some of the enslaved people escaped to quilombos, others were sold. A few remained, watching with satisfaction as the Casa Grande fell into disrepair, as the fields went fallow, as Oliveira himself died, not dramatically, but pathetically, alone and bitter, his life's work reduced to dust. Young Zola, now a woman grown, eventually made her own escape. She found her way to Cale's Quilombo, guided by whispers and the rhythm that connected all those who sought freedom. When she arrived, Kyle was teaching a new generation of students, his hair now touched with grey, his body bearing the scars of his journey, but his spirit as unbroken as ever. "You kept your promise," she said, watching the students move through their forms, their bodies flowing with the same grace that had saved Cale's life and changed so many others. "You planted the seed. And look, it's growing." Kyle smiled. "We all planted it, Zola. I was just the one foolish enough to dance in the open. But you, Tomas, Miguel, Tiana, all of you watered that seed with your witness, your memory, your refusal to forget. A seed alone does nothing. It needs community, it needs soil, it needs time." They stood together, watching the sun set over the Quilombo, over a place where freedom was not a dream, but a daily, hard-won reality. And in that moment, Kyle understood that Mestre Akil had been right all along. The question was never whether he would survive, whether he would win, whether he would defeat Oliveira. The question was who he would choose to be. And the answer was written in the lives he had touched, the students he had taught, the community that had formed around the simple, radical act of refusing to be broken. The story of the slave who used capoeira to defeat his cruel master spread far beyond the borders of that one plantation. It was whispered in the fields, sung in the coded lyrics of work songs, passed down through generations. The details changed. Some versions made Cale a giant, others gave him magical powers, still others said he single-handedly led a rebellion that freed hundreds. But the core truth remained constant. One man, armed with nothing but his own body and the memory of his ancestors, had stood against overwhelming power and refused to be broken. And in that refusal, he had given others permission to imagine that they too could resist, that they too were human, that they too deserved dignity and freedom. Decades after his escape, long after Kyle had passed the mantle of Mestre to his most gifted student, long after his body had begun to slow and his joints to ache, he would sometimes sit outside his simple hut in the Quilombo and play the berimbau. The sound would drift through the community and children would stop their games to listen. Adults would pause in their work. Everyone would remember. And sometimes, on the clearest nights, when the stars seemed close enough to touch, Kyle would close his eyes, and he would be back in that courtyard, his body moving through the dance, the circle of witnesses surrounding him, the impossible becoming possible. He would remember the pain, yes, but also the transcendence, the moment when he had stopped being a slave and had become fully, completely, undeniably human. That memory, more than any scar, more than any victory, was his true liberation. Because freedom, he had learned, was not a place you reached or a condition you achieved. Freedom was a choice you made, again and again, every single day. It was the choice to remember who you were, regardless of what others said. It was the choice to maintain your dignity, even when the world demanded you surrender it. It was the choice to dance, even when the music had stopped, because the rhythm lived inside you, eternal and unbreakable. And as long as that rhythm persisted, as long as the memory was passed down, as long as people remembered that resistance was possible, then the seed would continue to grow, pushing up through the hardest soil, reaching toward the light, inevitable as the dawn. The story of Cale, the slave who danced for freedom, reminds us that true power does not come from domination, but from dignity. that liberation is not given, but claimed, that the most revolutionary act is often simply refusing to become what others demand you to be. His legacy lives on in every person who chooses courage over comfort, who stands for justice even when the cost is high, who remembers that humanity cannot be bought, sold, or broken, only temporarily obscured. If this story touched something inside you, if you felt the rhythm of resistance echoing in your own heart, then Kyle's dance was not in vain. Share this story. Remember its lesson, and when you face your own moments of oppression, your own pelourinho, your own cruel masters, whether they wear the face of injustice, discrimination, or despair, remember that you too carry the rhythm. You too can dance. What would you have done in Kale's place? Would you have chosen mercy or vengeance, silence or defiance? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, your story matters, and together, our voices become the unstoppable rhythm of change.